Today is Friday, 9th August, and I'm going to, this time in this program and for the next couple of days, I suspect, reverse the order of the topics that I've been discussing over the previous 10 days or so, whereas I have been discussing in earlier programs the situation in Iran, the conflict in the Middle East, the way it's blown up between Iran and Israel since the assassination in Tehran by Israel of the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. Well, for the moment at least, I'm going to be focusing on the situation in Russia and Ukraine, and specifically the operation that's going on in Kursk, though it must always be remembered that this operation is part of a much larger conflict, the conflict which has been taking place in Ukraine, which, by the way, and as we will soon see, continues unabated. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed what I thought the likely objective of the Ukrainians in launching this operation in Russia, in Kursk region was. I said that it seemed to me that it's most likely the only target that Ukraine could realistically want to capture in this area that would have a meaningful effect on the development of the war is the Kursk nuclear power plant near the town of Kurchatov, and I said that almost certainly this is the primary target that the Ukrainians have been moving towards or trying to move towards. And I've seen some maps now, and maps which indicate the sort of advanced presence, the furthest presence of Ukrainian soldiers. And from looking at these maps, and I bear in mind again, I'm not a good person to study maps, but from looking at these maps, it does seem that the main direction of attack was indeed precisely towards the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, I'm going to jump ahead and say that if this is correct, if this is the Ukrainian objective, then it's perhaps a good point now to say that based on understanding the likely Ukrainian objective and looking at the overall situation in Kursk region, that the Ukrainian operation is now starting to fail. Now, I say starting to fail, there is a huge amount of fog of war and confusion about what is going on. There are many reports, some of which it seems to me are straightforwardly wrong. Others are accurate of themselves, but are perhaps being overinterpreted. I say perhaps because I can't be sure. But my own view is that if by now the Ukrainians haven't reached the Kursk nuclear power plant, and most reports put them between 25 and 30 kilometers distance from it, then it is becoming increasingly unlikely that they will ever reach it. And if they don't reach it, then they will have failed to capture their primary target, in which case the operation will have failed and will start to go into reverse. Now, before I discuss all of this, I would like to discuss various theories that various people have put forward for why the Ukrainians have launched this operation at this time. Now, Mikhailo Podolyak, who is President Zelensky's aide, very hardline aide, he gave a television interview in Ukraine in which he said that the purpose was to seize Russian territory, to use it as leverage in future negotiations. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It is all but inconceivable that the Russian government would agree to negotiate with the Ukrainians whilst the Ukrainians are in occupation of as much as a millimetre of Russian territory. The Russians have the forces to drive the Ukrainians back, and certainly they will not want to negotiate with the Ukrainians until that has happened. Other parties understand that very well. One party that clearly understands it is China, and we've had an absolutely furious article in Global Times showing that the Chinese are extremely angry, very, very angry about what has happened. Now, briefly, the article reads as follows. I'm not going to read the whole article. Kursk attack worsens conflict, dashes hopes for peace talks. And it goes on to say that experts predicted that the attack will undoubtedly exacerbate the situation on the battlefield and dash the hard-won hopes for peace talks that the international community, first and foremost, of course, China itself, has worked to achieve. The choice of timing for this attack has mainly taken into consideration the opportunity presented by the change in the Russian military leadership and the rotation of frontline Russian troops. Cui Heng, a scholar for the Shanghai-based China National Institute for the Shanghai Cooperation International Exchange and Judicial Cooperation, told Global Times. With Western voices now calling for negotiations with Russia, Ukraine wants to demonstrate its combat capabilities and determination at this juncture to avoid being quickly abandoned. And then we have angry comments about the United States in the same article. The United States has exposed its hypocritical duplicity as it claims to restrain the use of American-made weapons on the one hand, whilst in reality indulging Kiev with financial and military support. To some extent, the attack on Russian targets is the result of the United States fueling the fire. Li Haidong, a professor at the China Foreign Affairs University, told Global Times. The US's actions have not been downplayed despite international efforts for dialogue. On the contrary, it is hindering a peaceful solution to the crisis against the will of the global majority. Now, behind all of this, you sense the anger that the Chinese must feel. About a week ago, 10 days ago, they hosted the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba. He met with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, not in Beijing, as I had assumed, but actually in the southern Chinese city of Guangdong. Kuleba came bearing a message of peace, telling the Chinese that Ukraine was interested in negotiations, though the Chinese quickly found that even whilst the Ukrainians were saying that, they'd not come with any real proposals. And now the Chinese find that instead of actually pursuing the track of negotiations, the Ukrainians have escalated the war by launching this attack on Russia, which, as I said, is going to make negotiations impossible whilst any millimetre of territory, Russian territory, indisputable pre-2014 Russian territory, continues to be occupied by Ukraine. So the Chinese are very angry. I suspect other members of the international community will be angry as well. And going back to what Mikhailo Podolyak said, the suggestion that this has been done in order to strengthen Ukraine's position in negotiations, it is in fact going to do the opposite. It is going to make negotiations impossible. I cannot believe that there is anyone in Ukraine, even within the Zelensky government, who thinks otherwise. The second possibility, the one that many people have talked about, is that occupying a small number of border villages and perhaps the town of Suja in Kursk region, a town of 6,400 people, is supposedly going to panic the Russian population, turn them against President Putin's government, create tension and perhaps lead to regime change in Moscow itself. I'm sure that there are some people who still think that. I find it astonishing that by this point in the war, these extraordinary hopes continue to be entertained. I think that there is no prospect of that happening whatsoever. And again, I have to say that I think that by this point in the war, the Ukrainian government itself understands this. By their own admission, the admission of their intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, the Ukrainians have made several attempts to assassinate Vladimir Putin, all of which have obviously failed. And that all but confirms, to my way of thinking, that the Ukrainians no longer believe or expect that President Putin is going to be overthrown by the Russian people in any way. The third possibility, which some have floated, is that this is some kind of means by Ukraine to interrupt the remaining flow of natural gas through the Ukrainian pipelines to Europe. Apparently, near this village, this town of Suja, there is some kind of gas transfer facility, and apparently worries that there might be some problems with this facility caused a brief spike in the price of gas in the European gas market. I again think that there is no merit to this idea whatsoever. If the Ukrainians really wanted to interrupt the supply of gas from Russia to Europe, there would be nothing easier for them. They could just sabotage one of their own pipelines through which the gas flows. They would not need to advance into Russia in order to do it. And to reiterate again, capture of a small number of villages and perhaps a small town, Suja, would not in and of themselves be enough to shock the Russians into ending the war. The Ukrainians know that the Russians will inevitably, at some point, recapture all of these places. None of these suggestions, none of these theories make any sort of sense. Now, the other possibility that has been suggested is that the Ukrainians who understand that their front lines in places like Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar are crumbling, are trying to stop the Russian advances in these places by launching this attack in Kursk, and they think that by doing that, that will force the Russians to redeploy forces from all of these areas, and perhaps from Volchansk in Kharkiv region, and that will enable the Ukrainians to stabilize the situation in these places. Well, again, I have to say, if the Ukrainians did think that, there's no sign at all that that is happening. The Ukrainians, as General Sirsky showed in the interview he recently gave to The Guardian, are fully aware of the size of the Russian armed forces at this time. They must know that the Russians have enough forces deep in the interior of Russia itself to dispatch to Kursk region to contain and reverse the situation there. And I think that the Ukrainians, at least, if they really did expect that the Russians would redeploy their forces from other parts of their front lines, I think that this is misconceived. And again, I don't think that the Ukrainians really believed or expected this. To reiterate again, the only important object that the Ukrainians could capture in Kursk region that would make a significant impact on the course of the war is not the city of Kursk itself, which is a large city. Ukrainians do not have sufficient forces to capture Kursk. The only place is the Kursk nuclear power plant. If they can capture the nuclear power plant, if they can consolidate control over it, if they can establish defenders there, they can deter the Russians from attacking the nuclear power plant. The Russians would not want a battle in a nuclear power plant close to one of the major cities, which is Kursk itself. The Ukrainians could cling on to the nuclear power plant, seek concessions from the Russians in return for a withdrawal. Those concessions might be a freeze, a ceasefire of the conflict, or perhaps something that the Ukrainians have shown an obsession with, the return of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the exchange of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant for the Kursk nuclear power plant. And that might be what the Ukrainians are hoping for. And if, as I personally believe, there are other important facilities in Kurchatov, facilities that are relevant to Russia's strategic deterrent forces, well, of course, the capture of Kurchatov and of those facilities would also be a massive shock and have a real effect on Russian decision making, and might just conceivably push the Russians into making concessions. And I'm going to suggest that this is something that the Russians understand very well, and which explains some of the events of the last couple of days. Now, it's clear that when the Ukrainians did launch their initial attack on the 6th of August, the Russians did not expect an attack on this scale. And I'm going to discuss possible reasons why that might be so shortly. But anyway, that the Russians did not have large numbers of troops in the immediate area of the border sufficient to repel a Ukrainian attack. They'd clearly established no fortifications, no dense minefields, nothing of that kind that would interfere with the Ukrainian advance. So the Russians were not expecting an attack, and of course they would have been very worried that the Ukrainian forces, able to advance rapidly, unopposed through country roads, might quickly arrive at the Kursk nuclear power plant. So the Russians, it is clear, have been moving forces to the area, to Kursk region. And there's lots of pictures of them doing this. And I think on this occasion, we can say conclusively that these deployments are real. I know there have been some people who've been bringing up the notorious episode during the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive, where the Russian Ministry of Defense showed film of what appeared to be Russian armored forces, an armored column, moving towards the front line to repel the Ukrainian offensive. But in fact, it was just a film showing a column along the motorway near Moscow itself. Well, on this occasion, there's no doubt that the Russians are actually moving forces to the area. They are, after all, defending what is unequivocally Russian territory. And besides, many of these Russian troop movements have now been geolocated, and there's been confirmation that they are indeed arriving in large numbers in this area. But the immediate Russian priority will have been to secure the Kursk nuclear power plant and the area around it. So the first Russian reinforcements would not probably have gone in full force to the contact line, to places like Sudzha and other places. They will have been sent instead to consolidate control, to establish control positions around the Kursk nuclear power plant, to prevent a Ukrainian attack taking place against the Kursk nuclear power plant and the town of Kurchatov. Now, I say that probably there was anyway already an existing garrison, a defense force located there, but the Russians will undoubtedly, given the size of the Ukrainian forces, allegedly 3 or even 4 brigades, the Russians will have been concerned to make sure that the power plant and the area around it was fully protected against a potentially large Ukrainian attack. And this would have given the Ukrainians some time to extend their operations in other places. And that, to some extent, is what the Ukrainians appear to have done on the first 2 days. So we've had reports about various villages being captured, and the Ukrainians have also been able to send reconnaissance teams operating deeper inside Russia. And from time to time, these reconnaissance teams do appear to occupy, if only briefly on occasion, various villages and other places that they move into. But this is by definition only a temporary thing. Once the Russians have secured the Kursk nuclear power plant, assuming that they do, then as more Russian forces arrive, and we're getting pictures and film of more and more columns of Russian troops being rushed to the area, and apparently there is no shortage of Russian military units roughly in this region that can be deployed to it. As more forces arrive, it is likely that the Russians will begin to not just act to stop further Ukrainian advances, but that they will start counterattacking. And in fact, according to some Russian reports, and we can't be certain, of course, how accurate they are, but according to some Russian reports, the Russians have indeed already begun some local counterattacks. There's reports, for example, that the Russians have begun a counterattack to recapture a village called Malaya Loknia, which is located relatively close to Sudzha. Now, saying all of this and acknowledging that, as I said, the Ukrainians have been able to occupy and capture various villages, perhaps a dozen, perhaps a score, I'm not able to say precisely. It is important to stress that some of these captures of villages are likely to be ephemeral, and the main place that the Ukrainians have been attacking is the small town of Sudzha. Despite reports that were circulating yesterday, it doesn't seem as if Sudzha has either been captured or fully captured or even encircled. There are Ukrainian troops located in various places around Sudzha. They do seem to have occupied some parts of the western part of Sudzha. But it looks for the moment as if the Russians still control most of the town, And a Russian journalist who was in the area, Alexander Kots, yesterday said as much. So it may be that the Ukrainian advances have not been as fast and that the Ukrainians haven't as yet occupied quite as much territory as they claim. Now, that then brings us to the overall pattern of the battle. Now, there's been a lot of suggestions that the Ukrainians have reserves in the area, that they can commit, that they can send more troops across the border, that there will be more fighting in this area, and that the Ukrainians still, for the moment, possess the initiative. And that is probably true. But as more Russian forces arrive, as the situation with the Kursk nuclear power plant is consolidated, there will come a point, inevitably, when the Russian reinforcements start to exceed in volume the Ukrainian ones. And though there have been some reports of the Ukrainians rushing to create some sort of fortified positions, pushing people out of their houses, making fortified posts in basements, doing that sort of thing. In the short time that Ukrainians have, it's unlikely that they will be able to create effective fortified lines in this area before the main battle starts. One should not compare the very fluid situation in Kursk region to the fighting that's been taking place in Donbas, where the Ukrainians have had years to create fortified lines, including in some of the places that they recaptured in the autumn offensive of 2022. So it may take a couple of days, a week, more than that, but inevitably, eventually, the pendulum swing in the area is going to swing back towards the Russians. This is so, of course, unless the Ukrainians are able to achieve their objective, their primary objective, which is the capture of the Kursk nuclear power plant and the town of Kurchatov. Now, with every day that passes, that possibility fades, and there will come a point, perhaps we've already reached it, when that becomes impossible, and then from that point onwards, the whole situation, as I said, starts to reverse, and the initiative will move back towards the Russians. Now, if you read Russian reports, not so much from the Russian Defense Ministry, but from Russian reporting sites, that situation might even already have been reached. Redovka, this Russian newspaper that's based in Smolensk, says that already the situation between the two sides is equalized, that the Russians now have equivalent forces in the area to the ones that the Ukrainians have, and that this explains why Ukrainian advances have slowed. I've tried to understand where the Ukrainians are, and it does seem to me that over the last 24 hours, the area under Ukrainian control has not increased. I know there's some people who say otherwise, but I think this is probably a correct view. But anyway, I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand everything exactly that's going on. There's an awful lot of fog of war, and it will take some time to clarify and to explain things, and we will see what the true situation is, probably within the next couple of days. Now, the Russian commentator and blogger Boris Rogin, who I believe has a military background, and has been one of the most astute commentators about this war. He's made a point which I think it is important to make, which is that a lot of the reports of Ukrainian advances refer to the arise from the detected positions of Ukrainian reconnaissance groups. That doesn't mean that where these reconnaissance groups are, that the Ukrainians actually control that particular ground. And Boris Rogin says that once an effective front line is established and the Russians have stabilized the situation, then it will no longer be possible for Ukrainian reconnaissance groups to operate in the way that they are, and we will probably move to a much more stable and comprehensible state of the fighting. And I'm going to say straight away that I think some of the commentary that I've seen, based on, film showing, one armoured vehicle, Ukrainian armoured vehicle in one location or another, all, as I said, all of them up to now, tens of kilometres still from the Kursk nuclear power plant. Anyway, again, I think there's been too much of a temptation. Some people have found it impossible to resist the temptation of seeing a Ukrainian armored vehicle somewhere and assuming that that must mean that the Ukrainians are in control of that location. It doesn't necessarily follow that this is so. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry, very interestingly, has now published its latest update about the fighting. And interestingly, it appears, at least to some extent, to corroborate what Boris Rogin was saying. And I'm going to read it in full. As I said, I don't want to suggest that Russian Defense Ministry updates are absolutely truthful or authoritative, but I have tended to find that, with some exceptions, over the course of the war, they have been the most generally reliable, they provided the most generally reliable information. Anyway, this is what this report says. The armed forces of the Russian Federation are repelling an attack of the armed forces of Ukraine against the territory of the Russian Federation. Over the past 24 hours, units of Group of Forces North and Allied Reserves, Army Aviation and Artillery foiled enemy attempts to launch raid operations to the depth of Russian territory in Kursk direction. So there it is. Some of these films, some of these drone pictures, because they are coming from the Russians, pictures provided by Russian drones of Ukrainian armoured vehicles before they are destroyed. They are what the Russian Defense Ministry says are signs of raid operations. In other words, they don't highlight the advance of organised Ukrainian units in large scale. It's just that the Russians are hunting down and destroying as many of these reconnaissance groups as they can find, and they're filming themselves doing that. And that's how the pictures of these destroyed armoured vehicles start to appear. Anyway, I'll continue to read this report because it is interesting. Russian troops launched fire on Ukrainian manpower and hardware close to Darino, Gogolevka, Melovoy and Nikolsky, and on the western outskirts of Sudzha. Now, Sudzha, you notice the western outskirts. It looks as if this is where the Ukrainians are located. As of the time of this particular report from the Russian Defense Ministry, it seems as if the Russians still control most of Suja. Anyway, the report from the Russian Defense Ministry then goes on to say this. 5 Striker armored personnel carriers close to Yuzhnoye and an Ukrainian military convoy made up of 1 tank, 4 armored personnel carriers and 1 Cossack armored fighting vehicle close to Martinovka were eliminated. Martinovka is a village close to Suja, just saying. Moreover, air and missile strikes hit enemy reserves in Sumy region, and we have had now multiple pictures, including provided by the Russian Defense Ministry, of Russian Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers with these immensely powerful fab bombs, and they're busy dropping bombs on the Ukrainians. And then the report goes on to say, over the past 24 hours, the armed forces of Ukraine have lost over 280 troops, 27 armoured vehicles, including 4 tanks, 5 armoured personnel carriers, 18 armoured fighting vehicles, 6 motor vehicles, 1 155mm M777 howitzer, 1 155mm Crab self-propelled gun, and 1 D20 gun. And then there is this claim from the Russians of the losses that the Ukrainians have suffered since the start of this military operation in Kursk region on the 6th of August, that is to say 3 days ago. Since the beginning of hostilities in Kursk region, the enemy has lost up to 945 troops and 102 armoured vehicles, including 12 tanks, 17 armoured personnel carriers, 6 infantry fighting vehicles, 67 armoured fighting vehicles, 12 motor vehicles, 2 Buk M1 self-propelled anti-aircraft systems, and 3 field artillery guns. The operation to neutralise the Ukrainian units is in progress. Now, notice the number of troops, Ukrainian troops, that the Russians claim to have killed or wounded over the course of this operation. 945, almost 1,000 men since the operation began on the 6th of August. Now, I cannot corroborate these figures, but I have discussed these Russian claims of Ukrainian losses in the past, and I've said that overall they seem to me to be roughly within the region of being correct. I discussed how about 3 weeks ago, an article appeared in Reuters discussing shell production in the United States, and a Ukrainian army officer, member of the Ukrainian General Staff, discussed Ukrainian casualties with Reuters over a certain specific periods, and I said that those tallied very closely to the level of losses the Russians were attributing to the Ukrainians over those same periods. So 940 troops is what the Russians say the Ukrainians have lost. We have good reason to believe that is correct. And in fact, there are reports today that there have been urgent demands from Ukrainian hospitals treating soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, who have been wounded in this operation for blood, for supplies of blood, which also seems to confirm that Ukrainian losses in this operation are turning out to be extremely high. And I think this is likely true. I think that all the indications are that the Ukrainians advanced into a firestorm when they crossed the border and tried to move towards the Kursk nuclear power plant and entered Kursk region. And if this level of losses is sustained, and of course if it is correct, then at some point over the next couple of days, we're definitely going to start to see this operation start to fade out, assuming, of course, that that's not what is already happening. So anyway, this is my take of this operation up to this point. Now, I think this is as good a moment as any to discuss the question that many people are asking, and which I myself have been asking myself, which is, how is it possible for an operation like this to take place at all? How is it possible for the Ukrainians to assemble 3 or 4 brigades close to the Russian border and advance across the Russian border and carry out this kind of attack inside Russia? Was this the result of incompetence, corruption on the Russian side? Is it proof that General Gerasimov, who is the overall Russian commander, doesn't know his job? What is the explanation? Well, the first thing to say is that I don't know. I think this is an important point to make. A lot of people have been theorizing about what has happened, but we don't have exact information, actual information from the Russians to explain this event. We can, however, make some educated guesses. But again, it's important to stress that as of now, these are purely guesses. Firstly, I think that there is no doubt at all that there was negligence and failure on the part of someone. Clearly, these Ukrainian forces must have been detected. One doesn't just move 4 brigades to position at this point in the war and not notice them. So the Russians must have detected the deployment of these brigades, and instead of reinforcing the border and building fortifications and establishing minefields and doing those things to prepare for a potential Ukrainian attack, they were instead caught by surprise. But even that, to my mind, to some extent begs the question. And I'm going to, as I said, suggest a number of educated guesses of my own. Now, there have been some reports that the Russians have been planning their own offensive in Sumy region for some time, that they've been gathering forces in Kursk region and Bryansk region in preparation for an advance into Sumy region, and that in order to make that advance possible, the Russians have cleared their own minefields so that their own troops could pass unobstructed across the border and advance into Sumy region. In which case, it's also possible that when the Russians detected the concentration of Ukrainian troops in this area, they came to the conclusion that these troops were there not to attack Russia itself, but rather to defend against the Russian offensive in Sumy region, which both the Ukrainians and the Russians would have known was being prepared. And in other words, the Russians misjudged what the Ukrainians were going to do. And that might make sense. And I get to suggest here something in which I draw from my own experience, and of course it may be completely wrong, but I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons why the Russians were caught out, why this whole operation took them so completely by surprise, is because it makes no military sense. It makes no logical sense for the Ukrainians to launch an offensive at this time against Russian territory. The Ukrainians are in deep crisis in Donbas. Their forces in Pokrovsk, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk are collapsing. There's been more reports, by the way, that the Russians have captured more of the fortified buildings in northern Volchansk. It makes no sense, therefore, for the Ukrainians facing this massive crisis across the battlefronts to commit some of their best troops to this reckless gamble of an operation, entering Russia, trying to advance across tens of kilometers of territory to try to reach a nuclear power plant, which the Russians were certain to defend. Again, speaking as a former professional, I have to say that one of the things that professionals often encounter, especially those who are involved in conflict-type situations, such as lawyers and I'm sure generals do, is that it is very difficult indeed to predict the actions of an amateur. What to a professional makes absolutely no logical sense. What might seem to a professional to be a crazy thing to do, an amateur, Zelensky, Budanov, to some extent Syrskyi, maybe even some of the people in NATO, might nonetheless try to do. And that could explain, combined with the other things, why the Russians weren't prepared for this. Anyway, regardless of that, there is no doubt going to be an inquest carried out in Russia to find out exactly what went wrong, to identify who the general or officer or officials were who failed to make the necessary decision. No doubt a lot of people are going to be punished and are going to face dismissal, and we will see how it plays out. But this is all I can usefully say about this question. Suffice to say, the Russians were caught by surprise, but to some extent now, this is now an academic question, because having been caught by surprise, the Russians now have to deal with the problem, and the consistent story of this conflict up to now is that it is possible and has happened several times to take the Russians by surprise, but it is impossible to panic them. And there is no sign of any panic in Moscow at the moment. There's no sign that the decision-making processes in Moscow have broken down. The Russian troops are being deployed to the area. The situation clearly is gradually being brought back under control. And that perhaps is the more important thing going forward than the undoubted failure that took place before. Anyway, that is all I can say. Now, this, however, then brings me back to the other question. If this operation makes no military sense, and in my program yesterday, I commented about things that people like military people who'd been consulted by the Financial Times were saying that it makes absolutely no sense to divert some of the best troops in the Ukrainian army, the people who were in the reserves, who were guarding the border with Belarus, who were apparently there's one unit that has been taken from Chasiv Yar, where the situation for the Ukrainians is very bad. It makes no sense to do this when the situation elsewhere in Ukraine is so bad why would the Ukrainians stake so much on a gamble like this? Now, the Russian general, Abdi Alaudinov, the head of the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, which is now active, by the way, in Kursk region. Anyway, he's said that the situation is obviously serious, but it is not critical. The Russians are indeed bringing it under control, and that by taking this step, the Ukrainians have committed what are absolutely their very last reserves. This is, in effect, the last shot in Ukraine's locker. So why would the Ukrainians do this? Why take a reckless gamble of this kind at this stage in the war? And I think the short answer is because, as I have been discussing in several programs over the last couple of weeks, I get the sense that over the course of the last couple of weeks, the Ukrainians have finally realized that they're going to lose the war. And on the one hand, they've been talking about negotiations in order to avert the final defeat. But, as I have also pointed out, they seem incapable of making the substantive concessions to the Russians that would make those negotiations possible. So, given that this is so, and given the mindset of Ukraine's leaders, and by the way, some of their backers in NATO, it's not perhaps that surprising psychologically that the Ukrainians have gambled everything on one last throw of the dice. In fact, it's what you would expect them to do. One could even say that this operation is a further sign that Ukraine is losing the war and is likely to hasten the end of the war, as Germany's December 1944 Ardennes counteroffensive, perhaps fairly similar in conception, also did. Well, there we are. We shall see. Now, as I said, there's a lot of speculation in this program because, as I said, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of what is really happening on the battlefronts. But my own view is that so long as the Kursk nuclear power plant is securely under Russian control, the Russians will eventually bring the situation under control, and that by this point in the offensive, it is becoming increasingly unlikely that the Ukrainians will reach, much less capture, the Kursk nuclear power plant, in which case we might soon be talking about the failure of this offensive. Anyway, even as Ukraine stakes all, or so it seems to me, on this particular offensive in Kursk, everywhere else the situation gets worse and worse. Now, one of the most interesting things that has happened is that the Ukrainian General Staff or the Ukrainian intelligence agencies appear to have given instructions to their various mapping projects and reporters that they are to maintain radio silence about everything that's been happening on all of the other battlefronts and to talk only about the situation in Kursk. And, well, that's unsurprising in itself, but what is very revealing about this is that this Ukrainian silence is leading to a virtual dominance on the part of many of the other mapping projects and reporting agencies as well. One of the things that this whole affair has highlighted is the extent to which the various reporting agencies and mapping projects have been taking a lot of their information about the progress of the war from what the Ukrainians have been saying, as opposed to what the Russians have been saying. It is true that the Ukrainians publish an awful lot more information than the Russians do, but I had not appreciated until now how dependent all of these various blogs, Telegram channels, mapping projects, all were on the information that was coming from Ukraine. So, for example, there's been a lot less information about what's going on in Toretsk over the last 24 hours, though as I understand it, the Russians have managed to take under their control, at any rate, the greater part of Toretsk, and it is likely, though as I said, I can't definitely confirm it, but it is likely that the Russians are going to begin an attack on the village of Nelipivka, the last remaining village south of Toretsk, at some point within the next couple of days. There's also, I think, some reason to think that there is a very, very bad situation developing for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar. The very fact that the Ukrainians pulled troops out of Chasiv Yar to rush to participate in this offensive might suggest that the situation in Chasiv Yar was reasonably stable, but over the last couple of days, we've been getting lots of reports of Russian advances in central Chasiv Yar, west of the aqueduct, and I get the sense that the contrary is true. The Ukrainians are pulling troops out of Chasiv Yar precisely because they know that Chasiv Yar is soon going to fall. The 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian army, some of whose units also, by the way, appear to be participating in this operation in Kursk, are also complaining that the situation in the village of Konstantinovka, which they have been defending close to the fortified town of Vuhledar in the south, is becoming critical, and one gets the impression that the Russians by now may control a significant part of this village, and it's likely that they will control all of it before long. The only area where I think we've received some information, which we can, however, use, is the situation around Pakrovsk. And here, definitely, we can say that the Russian advance is indeed continuing. It looks like the Russians have definitely captured the village of Sergeyevka, west of Zhelanye, and that they have also captured the village of Lysychne, which lies north of Ivanivka, which appears that the Russians have also captured. The Russians, according to some reports, have also started an attack on another village called Sviridonovka, which lies to the west of Timofeevka and Lysychne. So, lots of battles taking place there. But the most important news from the Pakrovsk area is that the Russians appear now to have entered the village of Grodivka, that they're in the process of fighting and storming Grodivka itself. If Grodivka is indeed captured by the Russians over the next couple of days, then the road, literally, the TO511 road, is open for a further advance towards the key strategic town and logistics hub of Pakrovsk and its outlying suburb, Mirnograd. So there we are. The Russians all the indications are continuing to advance in Donbas. There's no sign that the Russians have redeployed forces from Donbas to back to Kursk to try to stabilize the situation there. The forces that are being deployed to Kursk that we're hearing about, including elements of the Wagner or former Wagner force, anyway, they do not appear to have been brought from the line of contact. The Russians have ample reserves. They have enough forces to contain this Ukrainian attack. As I said, provided they keep this Kursk nuclear power plant under their control, then it's only a question of time before they bring the whole situation in Kursk region back under control as well. Anyway, that's where we are in this war. The United States, incidentally, whilst appearing to distance itself from this operation, simultaneously has said that it's fine for the Ukrainians to use its Striker, in other words, American armored vehicles, on the territory of Russia. And I have to say, this makes me wonder whether, in fact, the United States not only did, in fact, have forewarning from the Ukrainians that of this operation, but whether the Western powers, NATO, might even have played some role in preparing and planning it. Obviously, they're not under the same kind of existential pressure that the Ukrainians are, but the political future of some Western leaders probably does ride on Project Ukraine. And besides, the larger problem of avoiding a geopolitical catastrophe in Ukraine, if Ukraine collapses, might be such that Western governments, still incapable of beginning serious negotiations, might support and indeed even encourage the Ukrainians to the kind of reckless gamble that we're seeing play out in Kursk region at this particular time. Anyway, that's the news for the moment from Ukraine. Putin himself, by the way, has now met the acting governor of Kursk region, or at least he's the governor of Kursk region. They've had a virtual meeting. There's a readout, a very incomplete readout, I suspect, of this meeting on the Kremlin's website. And the actual Russian Security Council is meeting today, apparently to discuss, undoubtedly to discuss the situation in Kursk region and to discuss it apparently in the context of combating terrorism. The Russians have been treating this operation as a terroristic one. One might not agree with that, or one may. But I've also seen a comment which appeared on the thread of some article somewhere. I can't remember which, and I can't remember who the person was who came up with it. So I want to make it clear it originates with someone else, not from me. But I remember reading in this comment that this operation in Kursk, as well as being perhaps Ukraine's last big action in this war, also marks the beginning of a transition phase in Ukrainian conduct, not so much of the war, but rather of the conflict, that even as Ukraine loses the war itself, rather like the Chechen and jihadi fighters did in the Caucasus, in the northern Caucasus, in the war that the Russians fought against them in the 2000s. The Ukrainians are going to start launching attacks of this nature against civilian Russian targets, like, by the way, the Crimean nuclear power plant, the Kursk nuclear power plant, making attempts to attack, to take hostages, to attack other civilian facilities, to do all of those sort of things. And that we might be moving from a war where Ukraine offers what might be described organized, conventional resistance to some kind of an attempt to develop a kind of partisan or guerrilla war instead. It's an interesting thought and a disturbing one, and one perhaps to bear in mind, and a fairly astute one. I ought to say that this attack on Kursk has not been the only attack that the Ukrainians have been trying to organize over the last couple of hours. They made another attempt to land men on the Kinburn Spit, on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, near to the mouth of the Dnieper River. Apparently 20 boats with special forces troops were sent to try and land. The Russians detected them. Several of the boats were sunk. A lot of people died. The operation was a complete failure, but it's likely that there will be others. There are reports buzzing around again that the Ukrainians might be preparing some further attempt to attack the Crimean Bridge. Who knows? Might be that that might also come. We'll just have to wait and see. But to reiterate again, it does look to me as if this could be the last spasm before the end, the last significant attempt that Ukraine makes to try to wrest the initiative back from the Russians. And if it fails, or perhaps more accurately, when it does, the outcome of the war will have been decided, and Ukraine, or at least the Ukrainian leadership, and those committed to its cause might then transition to something else. Anyway, let me now turn to the situation in the Middle East, where there's been less news, but again, comments which have been appearing in the US media. There's a long article about this in Politico, that the United States now believes that the Iranians have rethought their response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, that they've decided not to proceed with a major military strike against Israel because they've been deterred from doing so by warnings made to them by the United States. And it is clear that there have been some very threatening warnings indeed. In fact, there are reports that the United States is threatening Iran with dire consequences if Iran does indeed launch some kind of major attack against Israel. And there's also been suggestions that not only would this be a major American response to an attack on Israel, but that the United States would seek to destabilize the Iranian government and perhaps to precipitate some kind of regime change operation within Iran if the Iranians do press ahead to launch an attack. Now, that may very well be true. Well, it may very well be true that the Americans are giving these warnings, and it may be very true that the Iranians are indeed responding to these warnings, and it may be that they have decided to moderate their response in response to these extreme warnings. But I have to say that for the moment, I still don't see any sign of any change in the public statements coming from Iran. And reports which are appearing in places like the New York Times suggest to me that the Iranians may be responding to this American pressure in a rather different way from the way that the Americans are themselves reporting. Because we've had now reports that along with the Murmansk electronic warfare system that the Russians are supposed to have supplied to Iran, and the various other radar systems that the Russians are supposed to have supplied to Iran, that the Russians have now begun delivering S400 anti-aircraft missile systems to Iran as well, presumably with accompanying Russian technicians. And if these reports are true, and they are appearing in the American media, so they might be true, if these reports are true, and if there is this build-up of air defense assets underway in Iran, well, then that suggests to me possibly a different explanation, which is that the Iranians, who have never, in my opinion, been in anything like the same hurry to launch attacks on Israel, as the Americans have at various times been saying, that the Iranians are taking their time to launch their attack because they want to strengthen their defenses as much as they can before the counterstrike, possibly, well, undoubtedly by Israel, but possibly by the United States before it happens. And that they've called on their Russian friends, and that their Russian friends are providing them with all this equipment and material, and, as I said, probably technicians and advisors as well. And anyway, over the next few days and weeks, if this build-up of air defense assets continues, then what we will be seeing will not be a sign of a change of course in Tehran. It will rather be the lull before the storm. I still think this is much more likely. The Iranians have been very clear that the Netanyahu government is not only compulsively aggressive, but that it is seeking to provoke a war, provoke Iran into conflict, and that it will go on doing so whilst until strong action is taken to place restraints upon it. So I think that more likely than not, what we're seeing is the Iranians making their preparations and doing so perhaps with military advice from their Russian friends, delaying their own attack on Israel rather, until they're ready. But of course, it is also true that some of the Arab states are very keen on trying to get the negotiations to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza up and running again. Apparently, there's been some diplomatic pressure from Egypt, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia to this effect. And I suspect that that might also be advice that the Iranians will heed. Even if they do that, I suspect that will only mean that the Iranians will moderate the scale of their response, not cancel it entirely. But anyway, the one effect of this assassination up to now, is that Haniyeh has been replaced by Sinwar, much more hardline figure within Hamas, which is going to make, I should suspect, the negotiations for a ceasefire more difficult. And If it's true that the Iranians are getting all this military equipment from Russia, then of course it makes Iran a rather tougher target in the future. We'll just have to see. I still believe that an Iranian attack will come. We will see what it amounts to. But for the moment at least, the war of nerves in the Middle East continues. Well, that's my program for today. Rather heavy analytical discussion of the Kursk situation. We'll see how events develop on the ground within the next few hours, within the next 24 hours, and I will return to them, obviously, in my next program. Until then, let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you will find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. You can find links to all of these places underneath this video. And don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.